I'm incredibly honored to be here. And when I say here, I mean not only speaking with Andrew Weil, but in his lair, in his natural habitat, which is spectacular. As you'll listeners know, a lot of the people I talk to on this podcast are not world famous. They're quirky and strange. And so it's a real honor to speak with someone who's both quirky, strange, and world famous, which is Dr. Andrew Weil. I've already done an intro talking about your biography and stuff, so we don't really need to get into the well-known parts of your life. But I wanted to ask, let's take it way back, right, to Philadelphia. One of the first things that people notice about you when they become familiar with your work is that you took a very unusual route into medicine. Yeah. Through botany. Right. So what I'm wondering is, how did that happen? You don't come from a family of scientists or
no, not at all.
Much less botanists.
Parents were shopkeepers in Philadelphia and sold ladies' hats, and I grew up in a row house, pretty disconnected from nature.
What part of Philly were you from?
Northwest Philadelphia, an area called West Oak Lane that borders on Elkins Park.
My dad's from Ridley Park.
Okay.
Yeah, I know the
Philadelphia
area.
Was a nice place to grow up, and once I left, I hardly ever went back. But, you know, I think from an early age, I got from my mother a love of plants, which was something she got from her mother. Her mother really had a great green thumb. And so I think that eventually led me to be a botany major. I just was fascinated by plants, flowers, vegetables. I always wanted to grow things. And in my Philadelphia house, I had hardly any. I had a little plot of ground in the back. And I remember, you know, doing vegetable gardens out there and flowers. And I always dreamed about having a really big garden, which I now do.
You now do. You live in a garden, Garden of Eden.
But now, as for being a major in botany, I should say, when I entered Harvard, I really had no idea what I wanted to do, and I was interested in too many things, and people always yelled at me because I had too many diverse interests.
Right. That was my next question, whether you knew you were headed toward medicine.
No, I had no idea. And I went into medicine really by default. For one thing, I was interested in science. I wanted to understand human beings. It was during the Vietnam War, so going to medical school was a way of deferring decision about that. I had an intuition that having a medical degree would be useful to me, and I wanted I thought a medical education might be good, but I never pictured myself being a doctor. At any rate, when I entered Harvard College, I initially majored in linguistics. I was interested in how the language we speak influences how we see reality.
Fascinating.
But I couldn't study that at Harvard.
What year are we talking about?
This was 1960.
1960. So Vietnam was just starting to heat up a bit.
Yeah.
And
by the time I was in medical school, it was hot. Yeah. Anyway, my linguistic experience was I just couldn't study the things that I wanted in the linguistics department at Harvard. They were into structural linguistics, which was mathematical analysis of language.
This is pre-Chomsky?
Yeah. Psycholinguistics was just starting as a field. There was a guy at MIT named Roger Brown who was teaching it, but couldn't do it at Harvard. So after a semester of that, I transferred into psychology. But psychology at Harvard then was totally B.F. Skinner and behaviorism,
right?
And I fell under his spell for a while, but you know, my real interest was consciousness, and I couldn't. The whole point of behaviorism was to explain behavior without any reference to consciousness. Right. So finally, in frustration, I went into botany, and I had found in the Harvard course catalog there was a course stood out. It's called Plants and Human Affairs, and it was about economic botany, plants of economic importance, and you had to go register for it at the Harvard Botanical Museum. And when I went in to register, a guy came out of the building who was the first. I mean, I think he was a proto-hippie. He's the first man I saw with long hair, and I thought, this is really interesting. You know? And I'm sure he was up poking in the library, which had a great collection of books on psychoactive drugs. Anyway, that course was taught by Dick Schultes, who the father of modern ethnobotany, and I became his student. He was my mentor for a long time. I was on his faculty for years.
Was it hard to get close to him? Was he already well known at that point?
He was well known in academic circles, but no, he was like, it was possible to have a very close relationship with him as a student. And,
fantastic.
So anyway, that's really the luckiest decision that I made. I mean, I didn't know anybody else that was a botany major.
So for people who aren't familiar with Dick Schultes, the best book is probably One River by Wade Davis.
Right?
Amazing book. I love that book. But do you want to just say something about his importance
Schultes
as a
was,
scientist?
he was he did extensive studies in the New World tropics. He lived continuously in the Amazon from 1939 to 1953. Studying orchids, but in the course of doing that, he identified and studied a lot of major psychedelic, psychoactive plants, and was really known for that.
And wasn't his dissertation on peyote?
On peyote, right, among the Kiowa Indians.
Right, but he himself was not, he didn't participate, he didn't use peyote.
He did participate.
Oh, he did?
He did study that, He was, outwardly a very... stuffy Harvard professor, but I think really he was somebody that had, he definitely had a twinkle.
Right.
And he inspired a lot of, really great students. And, he sent me to South America and just woke up in me a great love of ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology. So that really was a very lucky decision, and it gave me a very different perspective in entering medical school. Because, medical school was shocking to me how disconnected everything was from nature.
Was it tough to go into medical school with a BA in botany?
No, I mean I had all the scientific requirements. It just was like very unusual. And
so you'd done the biology and the chemistry and the math, stuff, and you did all that.
Right.
Okay,
but it just was. Botany was a very old-fashioned field, that was relegated to the attic at that point. And, people didn't major in it, and I've met a handful of people in medicine who studied botany,
despite the fact that a huge amount of the pharmacopoeia comes from.
And it struck me that the lecturers that I had in my pharmacology course in the second year. Often had no knowledge of the plant sources of the drugs that they were teaching about.
Right.
But I think that perspective, being grounded in the natural world, really made me look at everything I was learning in medical school differently. And so that was certainly one. You said that I took a less traveled path. That was certainly one of the reasons. The other was that from as early as I can remember, I was always fascinated by the mind and consciousness. I wanted to know what that was, and how the mind affected the body. And I remember reading a book on hypnosis when I was a teenager that just fascinated me. And I wanted to understand all that stuff, and it was very frustrating in medicine to find that that was not of interest to people.
So here we are, 50 years later. Have you understood it?
Well, I think I have a better understanding than a lot of my colleagues, and I think the whole field of mind-body medicine has come into its own.
Yeah, largely through your efforts.
Well, I've certainly been one of the people that have helped do that, but it is, I think it's a very robust field now, and but there was nothing to be studied about that when I was in medical school.
Looking at your career and even starting in your undergraduate days, there's a sense that of a sort of fierce, a refusal to go with the herd.
Yeah.
Is that part of your personality, or were you just following your passions?
I think I came into the world that way. And,
okay.
And to their credit, I think my parents encouraged that.
So you were an ornery little bastard as a kid?
Yeah.
Were you?
Yeah. But I was very curious, and they didn't snuff that out. They encouraged me to follow my passions and my curiosity wherever it led me.
But you were a good student, obviously, to get into Harvard.
Yeah.
So you're willing to follow rules in order to get what you want. Right.
Exactly.
Well done. Okay. The most subversive thinkers are the ones who can slip through with a little bit of camouflage, I think. Yeah. So Richard Evans Schultes, seminal figure in your life and also in bringing a different perspective to plants. And you were talking about the twinkle in his eye. There's a book of the photos that he took when he was in the Amazon.
Yeah.
Do you remember what that's called? I can't remember. I think you wrote, did you write
landscape? I wrote a foreword.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Beautiful photos.
Beautiful, yeah.
And you
can. Lost World or something.
The Lost World, exactly. That's it.
Right.
Beautiful shots. And I remember one of him crouched sort of squatting on a rock with a couple of native kids next to him, and you can, like, the twinkle is really shining out of his eyes there.
The other mentor that I had in my Harvard days was a psychiatrist named Norman Zinberg. Was a Freudian analyst who was interested in psychoactive drugs. I got him very interested in marijuana, and he was my faculty advisor for the marijuana experiments that I did in my senior year of medical school. And he's one of the main people who really emphasized the concept of set and setting, that expectation and environment really shape reactions to drugs.
Right.
And I
which
think
people like Leary then sort of made very popular.
Yeah, but I think that can be generalized to all sorts of things. I think and I would say one of the unifying themes of my work and interest is how internal reality affects external reality. How what we have in our heads influences how we perceive things, how we interpret our perceptions, how we experience the world and reality.
So that sort of leads into a religious question, spiritual. Would you consider yourself a Buddhist? Do you have a religious affiliation?
I do not have any religious affiliation, and I make a very strong distinction between religion and spirituality. I think that spirituality is of great interest to me, but religions mostly have to do with institutions and perpetuating them. And
power and property.
And of the spiritual traditions, I'd say the one that I'm most comfortable with is Buddhism. But religious Buddhism leaves me as cold as any other religion. It's dogma and ritual and belief in things that are unprovable.
Yeah, I asked because in the Buddhist tradition there is an acknowledgement of how the internal state affects what we perceive.
And I think Buddhism as a psychological tradition is of great interest.
Right, I agree. Yeah, as a sort of a lifestyle, it makes a lot of sense. But when it gets dogmatic, it's as bad as anything else. Although I do appreciate the fact
they don't generally go around killing people.
That's what I was going to say. And there's no Vatican.
Forcing them to convert.
Yeah, and if you want to call yourself a Buddhist, go ahead. Nobody's going to get pissed off about that. Yeah. So Richard Evans Schultes and Zinberg and bringing you into this world. I don't want to spend a lot of time with Leary because you've spoken about that elsewhere, and people can see that in videos and whatever. But you mentioned let's see, Leary was teaching. You were an undergrad, and were you an editor or a writer?
I was
for the
an
Crimson?
Editor of the Harvard Crimson, the undergraduate newspaper.
And so Leary this is the famous situation where Leary and Richard Alpert were providing psilocybin, was it, or LSD?
Yeah, it was psilocybin.
Right. Yeah. And you heard about that and you didn't like that. You thought
that's a complicated issue. I was the main investigative reporter for an inquiry that the Crimson did on the whole thing.
Right.
The state of Massachusetts was launching a criminal investigation against them. Harvard didn't want them on the faculty.
So it was already out when you got involved. Yeah. Did you ever meet Aldous Huxley?
No, but I corresponded with him. And I got a letter from him shortly before he died.
And in 62 or so he died.
He died on the same day that Kennedy was assassinated.
That's right, 61.
63.
63, okay.
So, reading his book, The Doors of Perception, which I think I did the summer before I entered Harvard, that had a major influence on me and was one of the things that awoke my interest in experimenting with mescaline and other psychedelics.
I mention him because I think a lot of people who are familiar with the whole hallucinogenic movement in the 60s sort of see Aldous Huxley on one side and Timothy Leary on the other, where Huxley was saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but Huxley was arguing that these substances were so powerful and so sacred and important that they should really be reserved for people who were ready for them.
Right.
Because they could be dangerous, although they're not addictive.
So he envisioned a kind of priesthood, of shamans that would dispense them and control them, and Leary wanted them for everybody.
Leary just, thought the whole world would be better if everybody tripped.
The other, I'd say, polarity was between Leary and Albert Hofmann, a scientist who invented LSD, who I also knew. A very proper Swiss chemist, but also quite twinkly, who did a lot of self-experimentation. And he felt that Leary had essentially done in psychedelic research. that had so poisoned the atmosphere that it made it impossible for these things to be studied in universities. Finally that's changing again.
Yeah. Thanks to MAPS and our mutual friend Rick Doblin and other people, and Julie Holland, people who are like you, extremely academically qualified, who've put in the time. Rick Doblin was at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and Julie Holland is a psychiatrist, and Charles Grob, and lots of other people who have really risked their careers, I would say, to stand up and say, it's absurd that these substances are not available to a qualified practicing physician or psychologist or psychiatrist. Who was it that said psychiatry without hallucinogens is like biology without a microscope? I think maybe it was Terence McKenna, someone like that. He said a lot of things. So it seems that, from my perspective, that the politics has finally come around. And not to get too cheesy here, but you really blazed the trail. I think when I look at people who trod that path, who said, I'm going to go to Harvard, I'm going to check every box on the curriculum that anybody could possibly have, and then I'm going to stand up and tell the truth and risk it all, you're the person I think of first in that line. And, Leary, from my perspective, Leary was about ego and taking shortcuts, and his personal biography is very interesting for listeners. I mean, his wife committed suicide on his 40th birthday, I think. And I mean, he had a lot of tough things going on in his life. So I don't mean to be blaming him for anything or judging him, but he did seem to be more about himself, whereas you and the people who follow behind you seem to be more about bringing these very important substances and experiences back into an accessible place for people, because they are incredibly healing, and they can be. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe every society that's ever had access to hallucinogens have considered them to be the greatest gift of the gods. Yeah. And here we are throwing people in prison. Right. You get more prison time if you get caught with 100 hits of acid than for second-degree murder in the U.S.
That's nuts. Very irrational. And it's crazy that we've denied ourselves the positive uses of those. Same with cannabis. That the medicinal properties there are great, and and the safety is so great, it's foolish that we don't use that in medicine. So I think we are at a time when things are changing again.
Yeah. Why?
Maybe it's just time. Maybe it's a result of the, a new generation coming up that is more comfortable with all of this. But just something has changed.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. You can donate to the show at feralaudio.com. That's Feral, like a feral dog, audio.com. You can also use the Tangentially Speaking Amazon.com affiliate links for all your Amazon purchases. I get a kickback, and it doesn't cost you anything. It just takes a little cut from Amazon's profit margin, which is good for the world and good for my Christopher Ryan College Fund. I think we're all still paying off our college from the 80s. Check out the other shows on feralaudio.com while you're there, like Conversations with Matt Dwyer and my personal favorite, the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, which is off the hook week after week. You can subscribe on iTunes, leave us a review. The rankings will always help. And stop by sexadon.com and check out the book, the interviews, videos, all the stuff I've got up there. All right, thanks. Back to the show. Oh, okay. So to follow up with the hallucinogens, do you think that hallucinogens have a place in development and education? Do you think they should even be included in an ideal educational curriculum? Is that even a possibility?
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I think one of the questions that brings up is there an age below which it would not be appropriate for people to experiment with these?
Good question.
And I think the answer is probably yes. I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
But I think, that taken too early in life, they may interfere with normal development.
Right.
I think that they can be very useful tools, and I think the main caution is that they be used under the supervision of people who are qualified by their own experience to know how best to use them and how to shape set and setting to produce positive experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you had psychic experiences yourself?
Psychic experience.
Yeah.
Well, I frequently
paranormal.
I have a lot of experience of what I would call synchronicity, of either thinking of a thing and then meeting it, or thinking of a person and then they call. And I like to focus on that, and I think by focusing on that, it happens more frequently. And I find those experiences very reassuring. They sort of they reveal a bit of the hidden connectedness out there.
Yeah.
And so I have those kinds of experiences a lot, and I make use of them. I'm very intuitive, and I think I don't know whether you would call this psychic. I think by using intuition, I'm sometimes able to understand people and events and predict them by understanding them on a deep level, and that may look like some kind of psychic ability.
So understanding.
I don't see ghosts. I don't. I don't. I don't have experiences with spirits or anything of that sort. But this sort of, I'd say synchronistic awareness and what many people dismiss as coincidences. That's very important in my life.
Your image of the sun and the moon. Since I read that book, that's been like a touchstone for me. And it's funny, I bring that up to people. I've used it in classes I've taught.
Good.
And I try to pass it to people as a gift. And it's interesting to see how many people are so quick to dismiss that. What I'm talking about, of course, is, which blew my mind when I first read it in your book, the idea that the sun is many times the size of the moon. We know all this information, but we don't think about it. The moon is a fraction of the size of the Earth, but the distance of the sun from the Earth compared to the distance, relative to the distance of the moon from the Earth, makes them appear to be pretty much the same size, like within 1 percentage point, depending what time of year it is.
If that were slightly off, there wouldn't be total eclipses of the sun.
Right.
And here we are on the one planet where that happens. So yes, that's
the one planet that happens, the one planet with life.
Right.
And I wrote to an astronomer asking if this were the case on other planets, or maybe I wrote to you and you had spoken to an astronomer, and apparently from the surface of Jupiter they can calculate all this, and it doesn't, even with their 8 moons or whatever they've got, or whatever exists on Jupiter, this doesn't pertain. So there's no sort of mathematical necessity. This isn't what's the word? Epiphenomenon of gravity or of planetary formation. So Walt Whitman talked about leaves of grass, and I remember he says something about how the leaf of grass is like a handkerchief dropped by God so that we'll note his passing. And I always think of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of the sun and the moon. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of stuff like that out there in the world if you pay attention to it. That's just remarkable and makes you aware that, the specialness of things.
Right.
The other kinds of, I have experiences that I've had are of what I would call subtle energies that I've worked with a number of energy healers. And, I have one woman who was extremely good that when she put her hands on you, it felt like motors and then energy that would go through your whole body, and not subtle.
Is this Reiki?
No, this was her own, a woman who did her own form of energy work. But, that's stuff that regular science dismisses as being unreal. And to me, it's quite real. It's obvious.
Yeah, I mean, all you need to do is go to an Aikido studio to see things that shouldn't be physically possible. Yeah. It's amazing. Have you studied any martial arts?
I haven't.
I dabbled a bunch when I was a kid. I did kung fu and then karate, but then later, when I started grad school, I was in a first class. Actually, it was about addiction and drug abuse, and I was going in there armed for bear, thinking, okay, this guy's going to be spouting a bunch of bullshit, and it's going to be kind of a conflict. he was fantastic. He was like, he'd read all your work, and, you know, he had a very holistic, comprehensive understanding. Anyway, he was talking about how a lot of the people who came to you as a psychologist would be coming against their will because their wife or boss or the police or someone said, you get therapy or you're out of here. And he said, you can't resist that. You can't fight that. You have to find a way to use that energy to help the person and not let it affect you personally. And I said to him, that sounds like Aikido, right? And he said, come talk to me after class. And I went up after class and he said, listen, I can't say this openly, but if you want to be a decent psychologist, you'll learn more from Aikido than you'll learn in any grad school, including this one, or any teacher, including me. Yeah. Very, very interesting stuff. Anyway, talking about these experiences, I wonder what you think of Jack Kevorkian and the right to die and euthanasia and all this sort of stuff, which is also moving, I think. You know, the culture seems to be moving. What do you think?
Well, over the years, I've been asked by so many older patients especially, would I help them? Would I be there to assist them? I think this is such a strong need that people really don't want to be in situations where they're out of control and are unable to end their life if they want to. I think you have to credit Kevorkian with raising this issue to a level where there was really public discourse about it. I mean, you can argue about the methods that he went about doing that, but he's solely responsible for that, and it's very good to see that debate happening. A lot of this is done anyway under the table. I mean, this is quite routine. I think the hospice movement in this country has been wonderful, a really good thing. But still, there is a lot of doctors who think their mission is to prolong life at all costs.
Right. And sort of a warfare approach to medicine.
Yeah. So I agree. I think this is, we're seeing things change somewhat.
What do you think? Do you have an idea of what the way to institutionalize this would be? Is there because, you said it's a good thing that we're having this public discourse, but having lived in Europe a long time, sometimes I wonder whether it's better to just let things happen without the big discussion,
right?
Which is sort of how it happens in Spain.
Yeah, I mean, in general, in many situations, patients who are, terminal and in pain, it is commonly done to increase doses of narcotic medications until breathing stops.
But then that can get the doctor in trouble, right? Because they're monitoring their use of opiates.
Yeah. So that shouldn't be there. I mean, but I don't know. I agree. It may be better not to have all the discussion about it. And the big issue is do we need criteria for this? That it's one thing if a person is in intractable pain or has an incurable illness. It's another if they're depressed, for example. Yeah.
Although, years ago when I first started grad school in San Francisco, I applied for a job as one of the people you would get on the phone if you called from the Golden Gate Bridge, suicide hotline kind of thing, which I guess is sort of common for grad students in psychology programs. And I had a couple of interviews. It was a long time ago. I don't remember real clearly, but I remember the last interview was sort of with the boss. And he said to me, one last question. Can you imagine a situation in which suicide would be an appropriate response? And I said, of course, lots of them. And he said, thanks, but this isn't going to work out. Right. So it's like what you said about doctors seeing like their job is to preserve life at any cost. And I've seen people in horrible situations where I think they would have been better off if they'd taken control. But the reason they didn't was an intense fear of death.
Right.
So do you have any personal sense of what to expect?
I think the human mind is incapable of analyzing that one. I mean, I think death is the ultimate mystery. It's something that we're going to experience, but we can't understand it.
Isn't it funny, though, how we're terrified of what comes after life, but nobody talks about what came before? Yeah. Nobody says, thank God I got born. That was horrible. Right. It's a non-issue. And yet where we're going seems to be such a huge problem for people.
I mean, maybe birth is the hard part and death is the easy part. I don't know. Maybe there's no one thing that happens. Maybe there's multiple realities that are possible.
You ever heard of Ian Stevenson?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, his work's very interesting.
Fascinating, and I've read a lot of those case studies of kids that spontaneously remember past lives.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, and that certainly ties into what you're saying, that maybe different things happen to different people. Ian Stevenson, for listeners who aren't aware, is a psychiatry, right? He teaches at University of Virginia. I don't know. Is he still alive?
I think so.
Good. He'll be back if not, I'm sure. But he's done very scientifically sound studies of reincarnation in Lebanon, Brazil, and India, I believe.
And the U.S.
And the U.S. Yeah. And fascinating stuff where he finds kids who are telling stories, 3, 4, 5-year-old kids, about who they were in the previous life, where they lived. It was a village with a river and a brick factory, and they got hit by a bus riding a bike. And he and his assistants, grad students, will find that town and figure out who the kid was. And the
and often
stories
these memories
match
are
up.
then forgotten as the kid gets a little older.
Yeah.
A certain period, and often the previous life, there was a violent end to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, an accident or a murder or something like that. And sometimes birthmarks correspond to the point of injury.
Right. Of course, in India, all this is accepted as commonplace. In the U.S., it isn't. So,
right.
But yeah, it's fascinating. And I've always, I guess, I'm always interested in anomalies, things that don't fit.
Right.
And how people deal with them. Right.
Which gets us back to what you were saying at the very beginning about how language shapes thought processes and cognition. And so culture, in this case, in a culture where a kid talking about something like that isn't considered absolutely nuts, people are more likely to listen. Those cases are more likely to be uncovered and so on.
That also ties in with one of the main themes of my work in healing and medicine is that I'm fascinated by cases of spontaneous healing.
Right.
And I think the more we focus on them, the more they're likely to happen. And that's why I want to draw people's attention to them.
Right. Sort of like the way you focus on synchronistic events, and that sort of brings more of them toward you. Yeah. Yeah. There's an interesting, there are ways of affecting the field of reality around us without getting into what I consider to be pure bullshit, like The Secret or, whatever Paulo Coelho crap. I've got a terrible Paulo Coelho story, which I won't bore you. Oh, do you? Yeah. Do you want to tell yours?
Well, the book that made him,
The Alchemist,
is lifted word for word from the Arabian Nights. It's an Arabian Night.
Oh, is it?
It'd be
straight up?
If he acknowledged that, but
I thought it was the Odyssey. I thought he stole it from. It's the oldest story ever, right? It's the guy who goes out, has adventures, and then finds what he's looking for way back where he started.
But that one
Joseph Campbell,
right? But there is an Arabian Night that's exact.
Really?
Exact.
Oh.
And it'd be okay if he acknowledged his source.
Yeah. I had a job for a while in Barcelona working for the biggest porn company in the world. I was their in-house editor and translator. And the woman who hired me started sending me all these texts to translate. They had nothing to do with porn. They were all about some Brazilian who had been in prison, a political activist, and then he was a musician, a writer, I don't know, all this stuff. I was just translating it and sending it back to her, and they paid me, and I thought, this is strange. I was expecting, porn stars and directors and sleazy crap. It turned out it was sleazy crap because it was all Paulo Coelho, and she was using me to edit and translate these articles that she was then placing in magazines, right? She was his Serbian representative or something, and Paulo Coelho's literary agent is in Barcelona. So so The Alchemist and all that took place. The celebrations and the 10th year and the 20th year were all in Barcelona. Anyway, long story, but I ended up sleeping with his girlfriend. But I have to be careful about talking about that because she was married to a Serbian gangster.
Well, you wouldn't want him showing up.
No, or Paulo for that matter. But yeah, that's a story for another time. All right, so here's a question I've been wanting to ask you forever. A lot of your career, your later career, is helping people find healthier ways to live.
Yeah.
Do you sometimes feel like you're trying to teach you're trying to help fish living in a poisoned lake how to live healthier. Do you sometimes feel like?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we are living in a toxic world.
Yeah.
But I think that there's still a lot of things that you can do to protect yourself and minimize harm. Even if you're stuck in a big city with polluted air, you can spend time in parks where the air is better, for example.
You can have plants in your house.
You can have plants in your house. So the things that you can control, you want to exercise control over.
Yeah. Do you feel... My next book, I think I mentioned to you, is going to be called Civilized to Death, unless it changes.
Great.
So you can sort of see where I'm going with that, right? And I feel like every editor wants you to end with an uplifting chapter on how you can take control and make it better. But some of these things are so structural.
What's most annoying is that when society is structured in a way that makes it harder for people to make better choices.
Right.
For example, with food, the government tells you to eat more fruits and vegetables, but at the same time, it's subsidizing corn and soy and wheat. And there's one of the reasons why these very unhealthy ingredients like refined soy oil and high fructose corn syrup are in all the junk foods. There's no subsidies for fruits and vegetables.
Right.
So, the most expensive calories you can buy in a grocery store are fruits and vegetables, and they're out of the reach of
and you can't even get them.
Right.
Well,
if you're on an Indian reservation, if you're in an
inner city
neighborhood, you can't get them.
Yeah.
But all the junk food is available and cheap. So, that is very bad. But, the only way those things are going to change is if there's a collective increase of awareness about that. If people get angry enough, they could change the politics of it.
Speaking of which, have you taken a public stand on Obamacare?
I was an early supporter of that. I think it's a small step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But it's incredibly discouraging to see how even that small step provoked this kind of reaction that it, looked like it might not even get through.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's unconscionable that the richest country on earth can't guarantee basic health care to all of its citizens.
While paying much more money than countries that do.
Exactly, and has such terrible outcomes.
Yeah.
But the real problem there is that this incredibly dysfunctional healthcare system that we've got is generating rivers of money, and that's flowing into very few pockets. It's the big insurers and the big pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers of medical devices, and those vested interests have total control of our legislators.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't matter who's president, and it doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans.
Right.
That system is in place, and the only way that's going to change is if there's a grassroots movement. If enough people get angry enough to change it.
Yeah.
But you look at how effective the brainwashing is. Many people convinced that Obamacare is socialism. It's going to take away from them what they've got.
And it's the people who have the least who seem to really buy into that. Right. It's an incredible mind fuck that's going on. Yeah,
Remarkable.
And what you're saying, what you're describing with the healthcare system can also be applied to the military-industrial complex,
Absolutely.
all these wars that have nothing to do with anything. It's just about making money, Yeah. Oh, let's not talk about that. We'll get really depressed. Okay. Paleo diet.
Yes.
Okay, so I asked you about the paleo diet.
Well, the paleo diet might be a fad, we'll see. Yeah. And in its extreme form, I think it's rather silly. I mean, I know people eating raw meat and, and exercising themselves to death. I think the essential aim of it, though, of not eating refined and processed foods, that's the same kind of thing that I teach.
Right.
I think that's where all the trouble comes.
Right.
I think one of the big questions around grains, and one of the principles of the paleo diet is to go back to pre-agricultural times and eat what hunter-gatherers would eat. I think there's a lot of mischief that's come from grains and the way, let alone the whole ecological consequences and economic consequences of that. But I think in the diet that the way we have handled grains has made them very unhealthy for us. And most people really don't understand the difference between a whole grain and a pulverized grain. There's a huge difference between flour and products made from flour and eating a seed or a seed that's cracked into a few big pieces. I think it's okay to eat some truly whole grains. I think that products made from flour are a huge problem. I think the paleo diet is very down on sugar. The latest research makes sugar look very problematical for us. That especially the fructose content, which our bodies can't handle. One of the issues that I'm not so sure I agree with is a lot of the paleo people won't eat any legumes. And I think they can be very good sources of protein for people, especially if people don't have animal foods to eat. Right. So I think I think that the basic principles are not in its extreme form. I probably eat that way myself. I eat mostly fish and vegetables. Right. I don't eat a lot of fruit unless it's berries from my garden or things that are in season and really wonderful. And I don't eat any refined or processed food. Yeah, the Mediterranean diet, it has a lot in common with the paleo. Yeah, I mean, I find I agree with you. The extremists make it silly. And even the idea that there is such a thing as a paleo diet. Right. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, many different environments. And clearly there has been some evolutionary change in the digestive system. Right. People who've been digesting milk for a long time and grains and so on. But what do you think about the rise of celiac disease, and are these things? This is all real interesting. It's these food allergies. Is that real? There's a rise of allergy in general and a rise of asthma. My guess is that has to do with general overload of human immune systems. The wheat stuff is very interesting. Celiac disease is a well-known disease entity. You can test for it. Wheat allergy we can test for with skin testing. But now we have all these people who are gluten sensitive, and that's not testable. This is a patient-driven diagnosis. So people come in saying they have headaches and itching and bloated, and they've heard that gluten's what's doing it, and you put them on a gluten-free diet and they're remarkably better. But there's such a huge placebo effect with dietary change. It's very hard to interpret that. And I made 2 trips to China in the past year. In China, gluten is served as a protein. In any restaurant, you get sweet and sour gluten, gluten with black bean sauce. I asked a lot of people, gluten sensitivity is unknown there. People have never heard of it. Same is true in Japan. By the way. So that's very interesting. Where is that coming from here? I've heard a few interesting explanations, and one of them, which I give some credence to, I think you'll find fascinating. One is that we've bred strains of wheat with higher and higher gluten content, possible. Another is that until recently, bread was all made by a long sourdough fermentation that may change the chemistry of wheat. And then when instant yeast was introduced, that doesn't happen anymore. So bread may be chemically different than it was in the past. But here's a very interesting possibility, is it may have to do with gut flora and changes in gut flora. And the rising incidence of cesarean delivery, which has now reached a shocking level in our society. I think something like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 births are now cesarean sections. Again, driven by profit, not medical necessity. When babies are born vaginally, the microorganisms that they pick up that colonize the gut come from the mother's vaginal tract, from the birth canal. And that establishes the gut flora for life. When babies are born by cesarean section, the organisms they pick up come from the mother's skin, which is a totally different population. And in China, the incidence of cesarean section is very low. And breastfeeding very high, presumably. So that is a possibility. And, we're seeing more and more things about how gut flora really determine your allergic responsiveness. So that's an interesting possibility. I think this gut flora is one of the areas of medical research that I'm looking at most closely now. Good. When I was in medical school, the idea of taking acidophilus probiotics, that was something that, food faddists did. Now this is like very accepted in mainstream medicine, and not only for things like traveler's diarrhea and being on antibiotics, but, we're finding that it's beneficial in things like ADHD and autism and, really? Yeah, really interesting, wide-ranging effects of probiotics. I'm sure you've read about fecal transplants. Yeah, right. I mean, apparently they work very well. I don't remember what the disease is, but do you know what I'm talking about? Well, one is if the gut flora have been completely wiped out by, antibiotics. Right.
Yeah, there was something I read recently. There was a disease, I can't remember what it was, but it was chronic and there was no way of really satisfactorily treating it. And it was a small study, half a dozen patients or so. I'm sure they'll be following up, but they did fecal transplant from people who were feeling fine, and within a couple of days, the condition completely resolved itself. And
well, this is I'd say the whole issue of gut flora, probiotics, this has come into its own.
Yeah. Okay. Now that leads directly to a question I've been wanting to talk to an esteemed physician about, which is how human beings shit.
Yeah.
We shit wrong in the West.
In terms of position?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have argued that we should be squatting rather than sitting.
Like Asian toilets. Cassie and I have an Asian toilet in our house, and everyone in Spain thinks we're nuts. And it was kind of an issue when we were renting our apartment. We had to find the right person, a traveler, But once I'd been in Asia, coming back to the West just seemed so backward. Well, pardon the pun.
It's not, there are serious articles written on that.
Yeah, sure. But there's a whole book called The Big Necessity, which I've just finished reading. It's quite interesting. Yeah, about
that'd be a hard one to get people to change.
Well, there's gonna be a chapter in this next book about how to take a shit properly and give a shit about taking a shit. Maybe that'll be the title. All right. So you don't have a particular opinion about that. No. You don't give a shit about.
No.
Aquatic ape theory. Have you heard about that?
Tell me.
The aquatic ape theory is the idea. There is that there are a whole slew of things that human beings don't share with other primates beyond the obvious intelligence and all that. Saltwater tears, subcutaneous fat. The large floating breasts of the female because of all the fat content in that. The fact that you can take an infant human and drop him or her into water and they know not to breathe. You drop a chimp into water, they drown.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
So there are all these oil ducts on the shoulders and the head and the back of the face causing acne and things like this. So the idea is that there was a period, I first read about this in a Buckminster Fuller book. There was a period somewhere in the evolutionary past where humans were living in tidal areas, or pre-humans, and the safest place to be was sort of in the warm water, and we adapted to the aquatic environment in ways that other primates never did. And now here's where it gets really funky and weird. Part of the lineage stayed in the water and became dolphins, which is why dolphin brain structure is so similar to human, and they're highly communicative and intelligent and all that. And the other came back to the land and became...
I never heard that one.
Never heard of that. Elaine Morgan has written the most about it.
My daughter, who was born underwater.
I
there you go. Her, and that seemed
you delivered her. Wow.
Very, very sensible way to do birth.
Was it in a bathtub?
We rented an inflatable tub we had in the living room.
Wow.
And it was a very non-traumatic birth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how we make... Have you read a book called Born to Run?
Yes.
Another example of how we take a natural biological activity and make it traumatic, right? But like learning to run wrong and then selling expensive shoes that partially compensate. Birth is another one. An ex-girlfriend of mine had a baby. She said it was one of the most pleasurable experiences she'd ever had. But everyone was trying to scare her, telling her how much it was going to hurt. She didn't have the baby underwater, but she didn't have a C-section either.
Good.
Okay, wrapping up. We're sitting here in Andrew Weil's dining room, and last night over dinner he mentioned that no, I can't remember his name, the Australian mega billionaire.
Well, Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch had been here. Any other stories that you can tell us about the famous?
I have a lot of interesting people that come through my space. Some famous, some obscure, but all interesting. I've always liked knowing a great diversity of people, and I'm open to anyone, and I'm always interested to get other people's perspective on reality.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like you've been blessed in that sense, because a lot of interesting people want to meet you, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they don't have to be famous.
No, just interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm evidence of that, right? So, okay, fame. What advice would you give to people who, if you met someone who was, about to be in a big movie and their career was about to take off as yours, and you wrote 4 or 5 books before really
I think,
hit.
I was lucky in a way that my celebrity came late in life.
Right.
So I was who I am.
Yeah.
I think it could be very damaging to somebody young.
Yeah.
And I have very mixed feelings about it. Our culture is so celebrity driven, and the degree of fame that I have has enabled me to do a lot of things that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. It's also been a pain in the ass. And
if you could have the money without the fame, would you do that? Because what really enables you is more the money than the fame, right?
No, it's not.
Oh, really?
No, as I said, our culture is celebrity driven.
Oh, okay.
And it's both. But I'm a public person. And yet, by nature, I think I'm an introvert, and I may not look that way on the surface, but I think I am. And so, it's just a thing I have to live with, and it cuts both ways. I would say for younger people, just to be very careful about that, how much it can change your life.
Right, like who you talk to and what sort of relationships you step away from and step into. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I've had just a tiny taste of it since our book came out, and
but you also see, and you've told me that you see that the kinds of things it draws. You get both the positive and the negative. Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting, certainly an interesting ride, and you've been on it. How old were you when? Is Spontaneous Healing? Spontaneous Healing was the book that really changed.
You were on the cover of Time and all
so
that.
That was in, I was probably in my, I was already in my late 40s,
right.
50.
So your personality had formed.
So my personality was well formed.
Yeah, for better or worse.
Yeah.
All right. So can you say a few words about what you're working on now?
I put a lot of work into the Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona. I want to make sure that's on a really solid footing, and we train lots of physicians, and we're about to embark on a whole new course of mind-body research, which is great. In terms of writing, I'm working on a book of memoirs, stories, not an autobiography, just stories from my life, because I've got a lot of good stories. So I like telling stories, and it's kind of a natural form for me. So I'm just. Are you
changing the names to protect the innocent?
I haven't decided that yet.
Yeah, that's a big decision.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you going to? Will there be a disclaimer at the beginning saying this is how I remember it? It might not have happened this way, or are you going for accuracy?
I trust my memory.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. All right. Good. Yeah. Wow. Looking forward to that. Any idea when it'll come out?
No. I'm just slowly getting into it. So.
Wow.
I don't feel any pressure about it.
Yeah. Any teasers you want to leave us with here?
Well, I got lots of stories.
Well, I tried to convince you to join Dan Savage and me on stage telling sex stories. You seemed uninterested in that.
No, I don't think that's not what I want to focus on.
Well, so what the stories will be of what nature? Have you decided?
I mean, they can be from.
Because you've got too many for one book, I'm sure.
Yeah. Magical experiences, healing stories about drug experiences, adventures with plants, people, all sorts of things. So
maybe sort of a revisiting the marriage of the sun and the moon in some ways.
Well, it's something in that genre.
Right. Travel, less theoretical. It was more, practical, experimental.
And personal also.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Good.
Good luck with that. Thank you very much for taking time for this.